Zach Mole stretched his 4 muscular arms above his crystalline blue head, each movement deliberate and theatrical. The Galactic Military Academy's main training hall echoed with the satisfying click of his claws against the polished floor. Another day, another batch of supposedly elite cadets to break down and rebuild, or in most cases just break down. Attention, fresh meat. His voice boomed across the cavernous space, reverberating off walls lined with weapons from 1,000 worlds. I am Instructor Zach Mole of the Zephyrian Imperial Guard. For the next 6 months, I will attempt the impossible task of turning you soft-bodied weaklings into something resembling soldiers. The new arrival stood in nervous formation before him. A typical mix, really. 3 towering Carathians, with their stone-like skin and permanently scowling faces. 2 Veltani twins, their tentacles twitching with barely contained aggression. A handful of Grimlock heavy worlders, each one built like a walking tank. And then, Zach Mole's golden eyes paused on the most pathetic specimen he'd seen in decades. A human female, barely reaching his shoulder height, with pale skin that looked like it would tear if someone breathed on it too hard. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she carried herself with what humans probably called quiet confidence, but what Zach Mole recognized as impending doom. Oh, for the love of the 7 moons, he thought, his secondary eyelids blinking in disgust. Another charity case from the Sol system. What's next? Are we going to start accepting applications from houseplants? The human stood perfectly still, her hands clasped behind her back, staring straight ahead with brown eyes that seemed almost bored. The audacity was remarkable. Here she was, surrounded by beings who could literally tear her limb from limb without breaking a sweat, and she looked like she was waiting for a lunch order. Humans, Zach Mole mused, beginning his traditional opening day prowl around the formation. 200 years of galactic membership, and they still think their little projectile weapons and determination make them relevant. This one probably thinks she's going to graduate top of her class, write a memoir about overcoming adversity, and become some kind of inspirational speaker. He paused directly in front of her, looming his full 8-foot frame over her diminutive form. She didn't even flinch. Either she was incredibly brave, or incredibly stupid. Based on his experience with humans, he was betting on the latter. "State your name and homeworld, Cadet," Zach Mole commanded, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension usually reserved for misbehaving children. "Ravenstone, Earth, Sol System, sir," she replied in a clear, steady voice that carried just enough volume to be heard without seeming to strain. No tremor, no hesitation. Either she was an excellent actor, or she genuinely didn't understand the gravity of her situation. Zach Mole's mandibles clicked in what passed for Zephyrian laughter. "Stone, how fitting, though I suspect you're more like paper, wet paper." He gestured dismissively at her compact frame. "Tell me, Stone, exactly how much do you weigh?" 60 kilograms? 70. 73.2, sir. 73. Zach Mole announced to the formation, his voice rising in mock amazement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have ourselves a heavyweight." The Carathian cadets rumbled with deep grinding laughter that sounded like boulders tumbling down a mountainside. Thorkrun, the largest of them, leaned over to his companion and whispered something in their harsh native tongue. Both of them erupted in fresh chuckles. The Veltani twins exchanged glances, their tentacles writhing in what Zach Mole recognized as suppressed amusement. One of them made a gesture that, roughly translated, meant breakable toy. Even the usually stoic Grimlocks were smirking. Their massive arms crossed over chests that could serve as landing pads for small shuttles. Ravenstone stood through it all like a statue, her expression unchanging, her posture perfect. If the mockery affected her, she gave no indication. She simply waited, patient as granite, for the entertainment to end. Remarkable, Zach Mole thought. Most humans would be in tears by now, or at least showing some sign of distress. This one either has nerves of steel, or the self-preservation instincts of a concussed space slug. "Well then, Stone," he continued, savoring each word, Let's see what 73 kilograms of human determination can accomplish, shall we? Right then, meet Sax. Zakmol clapped his 4 hands together with a sound like breaking timber. Time for my favorite part of orientation. Combat assessment. Think of it as natural selection, but with more bruising and significantly less dignity. He gestured toward the sparring mats that dominated the center of the training hall. The rules are simple. 2 cadets enter. 1 cadet remains conscious. Non-lethal strikes only, though I define non-lethal rather generously. His mandibles clicked with anticipation. I'll be pairing you based on what I believe will provide the most educational value. The cadets exchanged nervous glances. Everyone knew what educational value meant in Zakmol's vocabulary. Maximum humiliation for minimum effort. Stone, Zakmol's voice cut through the murmurs like a plasma blade through butter. You'll be facing Thokran. Congratulations on your upcoming medical leave. Thokran stepped forward, and the floor actually groaned under his weight. The Carathian stood nearly 3 meters tall, his stone-like skin bearing the natural battle scars of his warrior species. His arms were thicker than Raven's entire torso, and when he cracked his knuckles it sounded like a minor earthquake. This should be over quickly, one of the Voltani twins whispered to his brother. I give the human 10 seconds before she's unconscious. 10 seconds, his brother replied. You're being generous. I say 5. Raven walked onto the mat with the same calm demeanor she'd maintained since arrival. She rolled her shoulders once, cracked her neck left and right, and settled into what looked like a basic human fighting stance. Nothing fancy, nothing threatening. Just, ready. Begin, Zakmol bellowed. Thokran charged forward like a runaway freight hauler, his massive fists already swinging toward where Raven's head had been a split second earlier, but she wasn't there anymore. She'd moved with a fluid grace that seemed to bend the laws of physics, sliding under his guard like water flowing around a boulder. What happened next made Zakmol question his own eyesight. Raven's elbow found a pressure point just below Thokran's ribcage that shouldn't have existed on Carathian anatomy. The giant warrior's forward momentum suddenly became his enemy as she used some kind of leverage technique that defied everything Zakmol knew about combat physics. Thokran's feet left the ground, his 300-kilogram frame rotating through the air with impossible elegance. The impact when he hit the mat shook the entire hall. Thokran lay there for a moment, blinking up at the ceiling with the confused expression of someone trying to remember which planet they were on. When he attempted to sit up, Raven was already standing over him, offering a hand to help him to his feet. Good match, she said simply, as if she hadn't just violated several fundamental laws of leverage and momentum. The training hall had gone absolutely silent, except for the sound of jaws hitting the floor. Zakmol stood frozen for a full 30 seconds, his forearms hanging uselessly at his sides while his brain attempted to process what he'd just witnessed. Around the training hall, the other cadets were equally stunned, their various forms of jaws, mandibles, and breathing apparatus all hanging open in universal expressions of disbelief. That, he finally managed, his voice carrying just a hint of uncertainty for the first time since the session began, was not a standard human combat technique. Raven shrugged, helping Thokran to his feet with surprising gentleness. The massive Carathian shook his head like a confused mountain bear, mumbling something about impossible leverage in his native tongue. No, sir, it wasn't, she replied, matter-of-factly, as if admitting she'd used salt instead of pepper in a recipe. Zakmol's golden eyes narrowed. In his experience, when humans did something unexpected, there was usually a very simple explanation involving luck, stupidity, or performance-enhancing substances. But what he'd just seen required skill, training, and knowledge that shouldn't exist in the human military database. Show me your weapon, Stone. The request hung in the air like an unwelcome dinner guest. Raven's expression didn't change, but Zakmol caught something in her eyes. Hesitation? Calculation? It was gone too quickly to identify. Sir? Your personal combat weapon. Regulations require all cadets to carry one for training purposes. I want to see yours. Raven's hand moved slowly to her side, where a simple leather scabbard hung almost invisibly against her uniform. She drew the weapon with practiced ease, holding it horizontally across both palms as she offered it for inspection. Zach Maul took the sword and immediately knew something was wrong. The weight was all wrong for human metallurgy. Too light for steel, too heavy for titanium alloys. The grip showed wear patterns that spoke of decades, possibly centuries of use. But it was the blade itself that made his secondary eyelids start blinking rapidly. At first glance, it appeared to be covered in decorative etchings. Closer examination revealed something far more disturbing. These weren't decorations. They were scars, battle damage, that had been deliberately preserved and incorporated into the weapon's design. What are these markings? Zach Maul asked, his voice losing some of its commanding authority. Family history, sir. That explanation explained absolutely nothing, while somehow making everything worse. Zach Maul turned the blade to catch the light from different angles, and the patterns began to tell a story that made his stomach perform uncomfortable gymnastics. A series of parallel scratches near the hilt bore the distinctive pattern of Veltani plasma claws, but that was impossible. Humans had only encountered the Veltani 60 years ago during first contact protocols. Further down the blade, a burn mark showed the characteristic spiral pattern of Zephyrian energy weapons. The mark was old, very old, with the kind of patina that took decades to develop. Near the tip, a cluster of tiny impact craters told the tale of combat against Grimlock shard guns, weapons that had been banned from galactic warfare for over a century. And running along the fuller, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, were symbols that made Zach Maul's blood freeze in his veins. Ancient Carathian battle runes, the kind used to commemorate victories against worthy opponents, the kind that hadn't been carved in over 200 years. Stone, Zach Maul said slowly, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Exactly how long has your family been carrying this weapon? Raven's brown eyes met his golden ones with an expression that suddenly seemed far older than her apparent years. Long enough, sir? Zach Maul's hands trembled as he held the weapon closer to the overhead lights, his four arms working in careful coordination to examine every centimeter of the blade's surface. What he was seeing challenged everything he thought he knew about galactic history, human development, and the basic timeline of interspecies contact. This symbol here, he muttered, pointing to a series of interlocking circles near the crossguard. This is the mark of the Andorian rebellion, 200 years ago. His voice cracked slightly. Humans weren't even spacefaring 200 years ago. Your species was still figuring out how to leave your own solar system without exploding. Raven remained silent, her expression unreadable as granite. Zach Maul rotated the blade, and his breath caught in his throat. No, this cannot be correct. A section of the metal bore distinctive scoring patterns, parallel lines that curved in a specific geometric pattern. These are impact marks from Thanatar battle axes, from the Sector 7 genocide. The Sector 7 genocide. Every military academy student learned about it in their first year. An entire star system wiped clean by Thanatar death squads 150 years ago. The official record stated that no other species had been present during the conflict. It had been a purely internal Thanatar civil war that had spiraled into systematic extermination. The Thanatars used ceremonial axes in their execution squads, Zach Maul continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone trying to convince himself of something impossible. These scoring patterns are what happens when a defender's blade catches axe strikes, multiple axe strikes, from multiple opponents. He looked up at Raven with confusion and growing alarm. What human would have been fighting Thanatar execution squads a century and a half ago? The human cadet's only response was a slight tilt of her head, as if the question itself was somehow amusing. Zach Maul's examination continued, and each new discovery made the previous one seem reasonable by comparison. Near the blade's edge, a series of burn marks formed a pattern he recognized from advanced metallurgy classes, Veltani plasma scoring. But this patina, this oxidation pattern, this damage is at least 100 years old. His mandibles clicked nervously. The siege of Veltar Prime, when the Veltani homeworld fell to the Coalition forces. The siege of Veltar Prime had been a defining moment in galactic military history, a 3-month battle that had reduced the most advanced Veltani fortress world to radioactive rubble, according to every historical record, every documentation database, every official military archive. It had been a purely Coalition operation. Zephyrian forces, Korathian shock troops, and Grimlock heavy weapons specialists. No humans. Humans hadn't even been invited to join the Galactic Coalition until 40 years later. "This burn pattern," Zachamol whispered, tracing one particular mark with his claw. "This comes from close-quarters combat inside a Veltani plasma foundry. The temperatures, the radiation exposure, only someone with extensive training in hostile environment warfare could have survived long enough to sustain this kind of weapon damage." But the blade held more secrets. The section near the hilt bore the unmistakable pitting caused by exposure to quantum fire, the terrible weapon of choice during the Great Purge. Quantum fire didn't just burn matter, it unraveled the fundamental bonds between atoms, weapons that had been banned from warfare for over a century and a half. "The Great Purge," Zachamol breathed, his voice barely audible. "These pits are from quantum fire exposure, direct exposure." He looked up at Raven with something approaching fear. Whoever carried this blade fought in the Great Purge, fought, and survived quantum fire attacks. The Great Purge had been the darkest chapter in recorded galactic history. A systematic attempt by the extremist Nexus faction to eliminate what they considered inferior species from the galaxy. It had taken the combined might of every major civilization to stop them, and the cost had been catastrophic. Entire worlds had been sterilized. Billions had died. And according to every official record, every historical document, every witness testimony, humans had not existed as a spacefaring species during that conflict. Zachamol's examination revealed more impossibilities. Acid burns from Korathian bile weapons, molecular disruption patterns from banned Grimlock disintegrator rifles, energy scarring from weapons that had been declared illegal by galactic treaty before Earth had even developed radio communications. "Each of these marks," he said slowly, his voice growing stronger as the implications became clear, "represents a major galactic conflict. Battles that shaped the political landscape of known space. Wars that determined which species would survive and which would fade into extinction." He held the blade up to the light one final time, and the accumulated battle damage seemed to form a map of galactic warfare spanning centuries, a timeline of violence and survival that predated human space travel by generations. "Stone," Zachamol said, his voice carrying a new tone of respect mixed with apprehension, "this weapon has seen more galactic warfare than most military museums." Zachamol set the blade down on the nearest equipment rack with the reverence usually reserved for handling live explosives. His 4 hands moved away from the weapon, as if it might bite him, and his golden eyes stared at Raven with the expression of someone whose entire worldview had just been fed through a matter disintegrator. "This weapon," he said slowly, choosing each word like he was defusing a bomb, "predates human membership in the Galactic Coalition by at least 2 centuries. It predates human space travel by even longer." His voice rose slightly. "According to every historical record in existence, your species was still fighting with chemical projectiles and primitive aircraft when these battles were taking place." Raven nodded once, a simple acknowledgement that carried the weight of fallen civilizations. "So, either," Zachamol continued, his logical mind desperately trying to find a rational explanation, "the entire galactic historical database is wrong, or," he paused, "the alternative too ridiculous to voice. Or humans have been out here a lot longer than anyone realized." Raven finished for him, her voice carrying the same matter-of-fact tone she might use to comment on the weather. The training hall had grown so quiet that the hum of the environmental system sounded like a roaring waterfall. Every cadet, regardless of species, was staring at the small human female who had just casually rewritten galactic history with a family heirloom. "Impossible," Zachamol whispered. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't. The evidence was literally scarred into the metal before him. How? How could an entire species maintain that level of operational secrecy for centuries? Easy, Raven replied with a slight shrug. Don't let anyone know you're there. Stay small, stay quiet, stay mobile. Take contracts from whoever's paying, do the job, disappear before anyone asks too many questions. She gestured toward the blade. That sword has been carried by 7 generations of my family, 7 generations of warriors who fought in conflicts that officially never involved humans. Zach Moll's mind raced through the implications. Mercenaries. Your entire species has been operating as galactic mercenaries for centuries. Not the entire species, Raven corrected. Most humans back on Earth have no idea any of this exists. They think we're still alone in the universe, still working on our first clumsy attempts at interstellar travel. Her brown eyes took on a distant look. There are maybe 10,000 of us scattered across the galaxy. Families who've been fighting in other people's wars since before your great-great-grandparents were born. The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Every major galactic conflict had mysterious gaps in the historical record, battles won by impossible odds, critical installations destroyed by unknown forces, enemy commanders eliminated by phantoms who left no trace. The Battle of Seven Suns, Zachamol said suddenly. The Nexus command ship that exploded from the inside with no explanation. My grandmother, Raven replied simply. The assassination of Warkan Grokth during the Carathian expansion. Great-uncle Marcus. The sabotage of the Veltani war factories on Proxima Station. Family business trip. Zach Moll felt like his legs might give out. For 2 centuries the major powers of the galaxy had been unknowingly employing human ghost soldiers, warriors who fought their battles, won their wars, and then vanished back into the spaces between civilizations like they had never existed. So, when your species officially made contact, he said, his voice hollow with realization, when Earth joined the Galactic Coalition, we already knew everything about you, Raven finished. Your military capabilities, your political structures, your weaknesses, your strengths. We'd been watching, learning, and occasionally bleeding for your causes for generations. She picked up her blade and slid it back into its scabbard with practiced ease. The primitive humans you've been laughing at. We've been your guardian angels for 200 years. Raven pulled a small sharpening stone from her equipment pouch and began working it along the blade's edge with slow, methodical strokes. The rhythmic scraping sound filled the silence like a countdown timer to Zachamol's professional dignity. The thing about family traditions, she said conversationally, never looking up from her work, is that they come with stories. Lots of stories. The stone moved with practiced precision, each stroke revealing more of the blade's mirror finish. My great-great-grandfather used to tell me about the time he held the northern wall during the siege of Carathian Prime. 3 days he and 2 other humans against an entire Grimlock assault division. Zach Moll's mandibles went slack. The siege of Carathian Prime was legendary. Every military academy in the galaxy taught it as the perfect example of defensive strategy against overwhelming odds. The historical records credited an unknown special forces unit with holding the northern wall long enough for reinforcements to arrive. That's impossible, he whispered. That siege happened 130 years ago. 132, Raven corrected, testing the blade's edge with her thumb. Great-great-grandfather was very precise about dates. He said it was important to get the details right for the family records. The Veltani twins had stopped their tentacles from twitching entirely, their usually aggressive postures replaced by something approaching reverence. The Grimlocks were staring at Raven like she was a walking piece of military history. Even Thorkran, still nursing his bruised pride from their sparring match, was looking at her with newfound respect. Oh, and the Nebula campaign, Raven continued, as if discussing weekend vacation plans. Grandmother always said that was her favorite assignment. Something about the way Nexus battle cruisers exploded when you hit them in just the right spot. She held the blade up to examine her work. She took out 7 capital ships during that campaign, single-handedly. Zakmol felt his legs wobble. The Nebula campaign had turned the tide of the Great Purge. 7 Nexus capital ships had indeed been destroyed by unknown saboteurs, crippling the enemy fleet and allowing coalition forces to press their advantage. Every impossible victory, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Every miraculous turn of events. Every time the historical records mention unknown forces or unidentified soldiers, probably humans, Raven confirmed with a slight smile. We've been very busy over the years. The training hall had transformed from a place of learning into a museum, with Raven as the living exhibit. The other cadets watched her every movement with the kind of attention usually reserved for studying divine artifacts. Zakmol, the pompous instructor who had entered this session confident in his superiority over all things human, now found himself in the unprecedented position of being educated by his own student. So, he said weakly, when you said 73.2 kilograms, I meant 73.2 kilograms of concentrated galactic warfare experience, Raven replied, sliding her blade back into its scabbard. Sir. 3 weeks later, the Galactic Military Academy training hall bore little resemblance to the place where Zakmol had once strutted like a peacock displaying his superiority. The change had been swift, dramatic, and utterly humiliating for his ego. Ravenstone stood in the center of the sparring mats, calmly demonstrating a pressure point technique to a circle of rapt alien cadets. Thorkren, who had become her most dedicated student, was taking careful notes on a datapad while she explained the finer points of leverage physics. The key, she was saying, is understanding that every species has structural weak points. It's not about strength, it's about knowledge. She gestured to the Veltani twins. Your tentacles are incredibly strong, but the base joints are vulnerable to rotational pressure. Zakmol watched from the sidelines, his 4 arms crossed and his pride thoroughly demolished. In 3 weeks, Raven had become the unofficial advanced combat instructor, teaching techniques that made his standard curriculum look like elementary finger painting. The Academy's champion, a massive Karathian named Groktar, who had held the title for 5 years, approached the sparring circle. He'd been demanding a match with the legendary human since word of her heritage had spread through the Academy like wildfire. The fight lasted exactly 47 seconds. As Groktar lay on the mat, staring at the ceiling and questioning his life choices, Raven helped him to his feet with her usual grace. Later that evening, Zakmol watched through the armory window as she sat alone, carefully adding a tiny new scratch to her blade's surface with a precision tool. 7 generations of warriors, and the tradition continued. 73.2 kilograms. Zakmol thought to himself, finally understanding the true weight of those words. 73.2 kilograms of galactic history. He had learned something valuable about assumptions. Unfortunately, it had come at the cost of his professional dignity and his entire worldview. But perhaps that was a fair trade.